Snow blasted across the frozen valley as Maya Ortiz squeezed the trigger and felt the sword buck against her shoulder. Orange fire flashing from the barrel and disappearing into the white oat while traces carved thin burning lines through the night. And in the roar of wind and gunfire she heard her own heartbeat pounding one stunned thought over and over. I was supposed to be stirring gravy, not holding the line. On the ridge above, enemy muzzle flashes winked like cruel Christmas lights. And behind Maya, huddled in the shallow ditch, 4 wounded soldiers and 1 terrified 19-year-old private clung to life because the army cook had refused to stay in the warmth of her kitchen on Christmas Eve. And as another burst chewed into the snow inches from her kneeling leg, she gritted her teeth, adjusted her grip, and shouted over her shoulder that help was coming, that they just had to hold a little longer. Even though the radio on her chest crackled with broken static and the last thing she had heard from base was that the rescue convoy was still pinned 2 valleys away, engines dead in the drifts and under constant fire. 8 hours earlier, the only sound in Maya's world had been the gentle simmer of stock pots and the clatter of trays as she and the other cooks tried to pull off something like Christmas for a tired, homesick battalion stationed in a nowhere corner of snow and rock that the maps called Forward Operating Base Harridan. She moved between ovens with practiced rhythm, thick black hair tied in a bun, sleeves rolled, an apron already streaked with gravy splashes and flour. And as she sprinkled paprika over pans of roasted potatoes, Specialist Harper from Supply leaned against the door and joked that she was working harder than Santa's elves, and Maya smirked and said somebody had to make sure these overgrown boys remembered what a real meal tasted like, even if the ham came from vacuum-sealed logs and the pies from industrial tins. Out in the mess hall, someone had strung up a sad line of battery-powered lights, blinking weakly against the bare plywood walls, and taped paper snowflakes cut by bored privates along the windows that looked out onto the endless white. A small speaker pumped out scratchy holiday songs, and for a second, as she lifted a tray, Maya let herself imagine she was back in her mother's cramped Denver kitchen, the smell of pozole and cinnamon coffee thick in the air, her father humming off-key as he fixed a crooked cross on the wall. That memory was why she had fought so hard to keep Christmas for the men here, even though most of them barely saw her as anything but the woman behind the serving line. To them she was Mama Maya or the kitchen queen, someone who made jokes and refilled pans and had a smile ready when they dragged themselves in from patrol, and few of them knew she had once worn a different patch on her sleeve and carried a medic's bag instead of a ladle, or that she could strip and reassemble an M4 in the dark faster than half the infantry. Her medic career had ended 2 years earlier with a roadside bomb that tore through the convoy she rode with, shrapnel shredding muscle in her leg and ending her days of sprinting with a trauma kit. The army had given her a choice, discharge or reclass, and she had chosen to stay, trading blood and gauze for onions and stock, telling herself that feeding soldiers mattered too, that hot food could keep Disby from sinking claws too deep. Yet on quiet nights she still dreamed of the one she had lost on that road and woke with her hands searching for bandages that were no longer there. It was near-dusk when the first crackle of panic hit the radio mounted above the serving hatch, cutting through the music and chatter. The lieutenant on duty frowned, turned the volume up, and everyone in the kitchen froze as a voice, thin with static and fear, shouted that Patrol Echo was taking heavy fire in the northern pass, that they were cut off, that they were wounded, that ammo was low, that the enemy was closing. The mess hall went quiet except for the tinny voice and the shriek of wind outside, and Maya felt her stomach drop because she knew that pass, knew every bend and drop from the week she had volunteered to ride with supply runs when there had been short drivers, and she knew how bad it was to be trapped there after dark. Soldiers abandoned their half-eaten plates and scrambled for gear. The Christmas music died mid-song, and Captain Reeve pushed through the doorway, eyes already scanning the maps on the wall, barking orders for the quick reaction force to gear up. Maya slipped off her apron, her mind already racing ahead, remembering where the snowdrifts built highest, where rocks gave some cover, where a narrow goat trail cut along the cliff face and could let a small team flank the ambush site. Reeves was a by-the-book officer, more comfortable with clean plans than with improvisation, and when Maya stepped up, still smelling of garlic and roast, and said, "Sir, you can't send the convoy straight up the main road. It'll be a slaughter. There's a better way." He blinked at her like he'd forgotten the cooks had mouths for anything but calling out portions. He told her logistics and food service needed to stay in the safe zone while his infantry handled the fight. But the radio squawked again, this time with a choked voice gasping that Private Langley was bleeding out, that they had only 3 magazines left between them, that the enemy was moving in closer, and Maya heard the background sound of someone praying in Spanish, raw and broken, and something in her chest tore open. Before she could speak again, another figure shoved through the door, snow crusted in his beard, scarf pulled tight against the cold. It was Tariq, the local interpreter, his dark eyes wide with a fear Maya had never seen in him before, and he gripped Reeves's sleeve with shaking hands as he stammered that the ambushes were not just after supplies. They had taken his sister and her 2 small children hostage on the ridge overlooking the pass, forcing village men to fight under threat of execution, and that if the patrol died, his family would die next as punishment for helping the Americans. The room seemed to tilt. Suddenly this wasn't just a rescue op for Echo, it was a desperate rush to stop a massacre, and Reeves knew it. Still, he hesitated, eye flicking to the whiteout outside the window where snow fell in heavy sheets, muttering about risk matrices and orders from brigade not to send non-combat personnel beyond the wire in such conditions. Maya felt anger burn up through her ribs like wildfire. She slammed her hand on the table, surprising everyone, and said she knew a route no one else knew, a narrow cut along the eastern ridge where the wind had scoured the rock clean and the drift stayed thin, something she had discovered when a supply truck slid and she had to hike around to guide it back. With the whiteout, an enemy would never expect movement from that side, and a small force could get above the ambush, take out the heavy weapon nest, and give Echo a chance to break contact. Reeves stared at her, seeing not just a cook but a woman with a scar on her leg and a dangerous certainty in her voice. Harper backed her up, saying he had been on that run and that Maya had practically dragged the truck to safety, that if anyone knew those hills it was her. The captain rubbed his temples, torn between protocol and the very human dread of hearing his patrol die over the radio, and finally he swore under his breath and said fine, she could go, but only as support, stay behind the line, carry extra ammo, nothing more. Maya nodded, because she knew once she was out there the mountain and the moment would decide what she became. 20 minutes later she was in full kit, the unfamiliar weight settling on her shoulders like a memory she had tried to forget. Her leg ached, but she tightened her brace and ignored it, checking her rifle, stuffing extra tourniquets into her vest pockets out of old habit, then grabbing a crate of ammo belts and slinging it over one shoulder. Outside, the night had turned the world into a tunnel of blowing snow, the horizon erased. A squad of 8 soldiers waited by the idling striker, their faces ghost pale in the floodlights, breath steaming, eyes flicking skeptically to the cook joining them. One of them, Sergeant Malloy, tall and impatient, snorted and muttered that this wasn't a field kitchen, that they needed shooters not soup stirrers, and for a second Maya's cheeks burned. But then the radio on the striker crackled with another desperate call from Echo, someone screaming in pain in the background, and she saw the way Malloy's jaw clenched, the way his eyes shone with fear beneath the bravado, and she realized they were all just doing the same thing, trying to hide how much this scared them. She climbed into the vehicle without replying, sat opposite a baby-faced private who clutched his rifle like a lifeline, and as they rolled out through the front gate into the storm, passing the strings of Christmas lights that now looked garish and fragile against the black sky, Maya found herself whispering a quiet prayer her mother had taught her, not for herself, but for the men they were going to reach and for the strangers held at gunpoint on that ridge. The ride was a nightmare of banging metal and loaching turns as the driver fought the ice under the wheels. The windshield wipers could barely keep up, and twice the striker skidded close to the edge of the road where the ground fell away into darkness. Maya kept her eyes on the map tablet, tracing the outline of the land in her mind, calling out corrections to the driver, guiding them toward the obscure trailhead she knew, and the act of giving orders settled the nerves, reminded her of long nights in the aid station where she had told panicking soldiers to breathe while she stitched them back together. When they reached the point where the road bent toward the pass, Maya tapped the hatch and told them this was where they had to dismount. Malloy argued, wanting to push the vehicle further, but she pointed to the steep slope and the way snow piled in deceptive drifts, saying one wrong move and they would bog down, making an easy target. and after a moment he nodded grudgingly, eyes scanning the white darkness. They stepped into the storm, snow instantly soaking their boots, wind tearing at their faces. Visibility dropped to a few yards, and their world shrank to the beam of their night vision and the crunch of their own footsteps. Maya led them to the narrow cut, a faint line in the rock that most eyes would have missed, and they began to climb, single file, boots slipping on icy stone, breathing ragged. Halfway up, the radio caught fragments of Echo's situation, the frantic words of their sergeant reporting that the enemy had moved a heavy machine gun onto the ridge, firing down on their position, that they were pinned flat in a shallow depression with nowhere to go. Maya could almost see it, could almost smell the cordite and blood, and she pushed herself harder, ignoring the fire in her rebuilt leg. At the top they crawled to the lip of the ridge and peered over, and the scene below carved itself into her memory forever. In the pale glow of muzzle flashes and occasional flares, the pass was a jagged gash choked with blowing snow. Echo's battered vehicles huddled near the center like wounded animals, small figures firing from behind tires and rocks while enemy fighters swarmed the slopes, some wearing mismatched gear, some in stolen uniforms, all moving with the desperate fury of men pushed by someone else's threats. On a higher knob of rock to the left, the heavy machine gun spat continuous fire, chewing the ground around Echo's position, sparks and snow leaping with every impact. And there, near the gun, bound and huddled in the lee of a boulder, she saw 3 tiny shapes and one taller one, all wrapped in dark cloth. Even from here, even through the storm, she knew they had to be Tariq's family, held close as shields against any airstrike. The sight squeezed her chest until she could hardly breathe. Malloy cursed softly, already signaling his men to fan out. But the ridge was narrow, the cover thin, and any full volley would risk hitting the hostages. They were trapped by their own conscience. This was where, Maya realized, the fact that she was just a cook became her strange advantage, because she was used to solving problems with the wrong tools, turning whatever she had into something that could save a meal, or now, maybe, save lives. She glanced at the pack on her back, at the mortar flays and smoke canisters they had grabbed in a hurry, and an idea formed, half memory of a kitchen accident, half instinct. She motioned for them to hand over 2 smoke grenades and a flare, then whispered her plan. They would throw smoke so that the wind pushed a thick curtain across the machine gun's line of sight, and as the gunners fired blind, she would crawl forward to a closer rock, pop the flare behind her to silhouette herself as a decoy target, drawing their attention while Malloy and 2 sharpshooters took up positions at angles that allowed a clear shot once the gun swung to her. It was insane, and she saw it in their faces. But there was no other way that didn't risk the hostages, and somewhere below a young man named Langley was bleeding out by the minute. Maya's hands shook as she pulled the pin on the first smoke grenade, the metal ring cold against her fingers, and when they lobbed the canisters forward, the wind grabbed the billowing clouds and dragged them across the ridge in swirling sheets. Almost immediately the machine gun's tracer line jerked and wandered, cutting through the white veil in wild arcs. Maya slid forward on her belly, feeling the ice bite through her uniform, heart hammering so loud she was sure the enemy could hear it, and when she reached a jagged outcrop halfway between her squad and the gun, she took a steadying breath, remembered the way she used to count seconds between stirring pots, and snapped the flare to life before tossing it to land against the rock behind her. Red light exploded, painting her silhouette in stark black against the glow, and within a heartbeat the machine gun pivoted, spitting fire in her direction. Chunks of rock shattered inches from her head, hot fragments stinging her cheek, and she bit back a scream, pressing herself flat, trusting that Malloy and the others were doing their part. They were. 2 rifles cracked almost as one, sharp and precise, and through the chaos Maya heard the choking stutter of the gun cutting off, then the shout of confused men as the weapon's crew crumpled. Echo seized the moment. Their sergeant roared a charge, and the surviving soldiers surged up from the depression, firing and moving, pushing toward the base of the ridge. What happened next blurred into fragments for Maya, a jumble of snow and shouting and muzzle flashes as her squad poured fire into the enemy lines, careful and controlled to avoid the hostages, while she scrambled down a narrow goat track she had spotted, sliding the last few meters and landing hard near the bound family. One of the militants turned toward her, rifle rising, and she fired before he could, the recoil slamming into her shoulder, the man dropping into the snow with a look of startled disbelief that haunted her long after. Then she was at the hostages, cutting ropes with her knife, her medic habits roaring back as she checked them over quickly, murmuring soothing nonsense in a mix of English and broken phrases she had picked up from Tariq, trying to keep the children from seeing the bodies around them. The older woman, Tariq's sister, clutched Maya's arm and whispered something that sounded like a blessing, tears freezing on her cheeks, and Maya felt a weight she hadn't known she carried begin to shift, as if some debt she owed to the ghosts on that burned road long ago had finally been paid in part. Together with two soldiers who had scrambled up to secure the position, they moved the family behind better cover, just as an explosion shook the ridge. One of Echo's vehicles, hit in the earlier fight, finally went up in a fireball, sending a shockwave of heat even through the snow, and for a terrifying second Maya thought they were all going to be thrown off the cliff. She grabbed the closest child, curled her body around the tiny frame, and dug her fingers into the ice until her nails tore. When the world stopped tilting, the valley was quieter. The enemy fighters, seeing their heavy gun lost and one of their vehicles hit by recoiling fire, began to break, some scattering into the storm, others throwing down their weapons. Echo's survivors stumbled toward the ridge, faces streaked with soot and blood, eyes wide when they saw the cook from the mess hall standing among them with a rifle slung over one shoulder and a sleeping child on the other. Private Langley was alive but barely, a ragged bandage tied around his side, and when Maya saw the sluggish seep of blood she snapped into full medic mode, barking for gauze, ordering someone to hold pressure while she improvised a better wrap with a shredded scarf and a tourniquet. She talked to him the whole time, reminding him of the stupid joke he had made that morning about the ham being weaponized, promising him he would get to complain about her cooking again if he just kept his eyes open. They held that position until the second convoy finally fought its way through the snow, headlights ghostly through the storm. Medics swarmed the wounded, engineers checked the stability of the pass, and over it all, Reeves's voice crackled with stunned disbelief as he heard the first reports of what had happened on the ridge, of who had led them there, of who had drawn fire and freed the hostages. By the time they made it back to the base, it was near dawn on Christmas Day, the sky a pale gray streaked with the first hints of pink, and the mess hall that had been full of laughter hours earlier now smelled of cold, burnt coffee and abandoned food. Only the little battery lights still blinked, stubbornly cheerful in the aftermath. Maya limped in on a crutch, legs screaming protest after the strain, uniform torn and stained, face streaked where a graze on her cheek had bled and frozen. Conversations died as soldiers turned to look, and for a moment she wanted to shrink back into the kitchen and disappear. Instead she straightened, feeling every ache, and moved toward the serving line where one of the junior cooks stood, eyes round, not sure whether to hug her or salute. Reeves stepped forward before anyone else could, his normally crisp posture softened by exhaustion and something like shame. He cleared his throat, the sound rough, and said that last night a lot of men had lived because someone who was supposed to stay behind stoves had refused to accept the limits other people put on her, that she had read the land better than any map, outthought an enemy position, and risked herself to protect both her own and the innocent. He held up a small box, the hastily prepared field version of a commendation he had requested on the spot, his voice trembling slightly as he pinned the ribbon to her chest. Maya stared down at it, the metal cold against her skin, and felt a strange mix of pride and grief wash through her. Because no medal could bring back the ones lost, but maybe, just maybe, it meant the army finally saw all of her, not just the apron. Malloy started the applause, slow and hesitant, then louder as others joined in. Harper whistled. Tariq stepped forward with his sister and her kids, who pressed a folded piece of cloth into Maya's hands, a scarf woven in bright colors that stood out vivid against the gray morning, and told her through tears that in their village they had a word for someone who fed and defended at the same time, a word that meant warrior of the hearth. Maya didn't entirely understand the phrase, but she understood the way the little girl hugged her leg, the way Langley, pale but upright on crutches, limped in just in time to salute her with a shaking hand and joke weakly that he'd never again complain about Christmas ham as long as he lived. The years that followed did not turn Maya into a legend in the way war stories usually meant. There were no movies, no viral clips, just a line in a citation and a paragraph in a battalion history book. But every Christmas after that, wherever she was stationed, she made sure the kitchen stayed open late, that there was always something hot for the ones who had to pull guard duty or sit by radios. And the younger soldiers would nudge each other and say that back in Harridan she had once led a rescue in a blizzard, even if half of them got the details wrong. She moved back into medical work as a trainer, teaching new medics and cooks how to keep calm under pressure, using stories from that night to show that roles were tools, not cages, and that sometimes the person everyone underestimated was the one who saved the day because they saw what others missed. One Christmas Eve, many years after Harridan had been abandoned and snow had reclaimed its runways, Maya sat at a long table in a stateside base cafeteria, watching a new generation of soldiers laugh and trade stories. Beside her sat Langley, now a staff sergeant with a faint limp and a scar along his ribcage, who liked to tell rookies that an army cook had dragged him back from the edge with nothing but a scarf and sheer stubbornness. And across from them Tariq's niece, now grown in serving as a translator in her own right, practiced her English by teasing Maya about overcooking the turkey. Outside, soft snow fell again, and through the window Maya could see the reflection of that old ribbon on her chest, hanging beside a small charm the village woman had given her, etched with that phrase for warrior of the hearth. She touched both lightly and smiled, realizing that the night on the ridge had not just been about saving others but about saving a part of herself she had almost given up, the part that believed she could still be more than the boxes people put her in. Somewhere out there, she knew, another patrol would be running late, another storm would be rolling in, another frightened young private would be whispering a prayer into the dark, and maybe another cook, another mechanic, another just a something, would be the one who stepped forward when everyone else hesitated. As the clock on the wall ticked toward midnight and someone turned on a scratched recording of an old carol, Maya lifted her coffee, felt its warmth seep into her palms, and whispered a quiet thanks for the night the world had demanded more of her than anyone thought she could give, because that night had rewritten her story forever, turning Christmas Eve from a day of ghosts into a day of quiet, stubborn courage. And she knew that as long as she lived she would carry that ridge in her bones. A reminder that even in the coldest places, a single decision to say yes can light a fire no blizzard can ever put out. Years later, when the army finally let her go and the last out-processing form was signed, Maya went home to Colorado and tried to learn what life felt like without a weapon or radio on her chest. The VA clinic hired her to run the cafeteria, saying a veteran would understand what the men and women in the line really needed on bad days, and she found herself back in a white apron. Only now the walls were covered in posters about trauma and recovery instead of deployment maps. Most people then knew only that she had seen some things and walked with a limp. A few older vets had dug up the Harridan story online and passed it around, but inside the kitchen she kept her head down and let the food speak for her. On cold mornings, when frost painted the parking lot and the sky had that same low steel color as the night on the ridge, she would pause as she stirred a pot and feel memory nudge at her ribs, then take a breath and go back to work. One gray afternoon a week before Christmas, the lunch rush died down and she noticed a teenage girl hovering by the trash can, clutching an empty tray like a shield. The girl had a buzzed undercut half hidden beneath a knit cap, eyes rimmed red, and when Maya asked if she was waiting for someone, the words spilled out in a rush. Her name was Riley. Her older brother had been with Echo Company. He was upstairs in the truck, she said, not even able to step into the lobby, staring at the clinic doors like they were an enemy bunker. He hated Christmas now. He woke up choking on air that tasted like smoke. The only time he softened was when he talked about a story he had heard from other soldiers, about an army cook who crawled toward a machine gun on Christmas Eve so men could come home. Riley swallowed hard and asked if that story was real, and if it was, whether Maya could talk to her brother. Just for a minute, I swear. For a heartbeat, Maya wanted to say no. She was tired, her leg ached, there were pans to scrub and inventory to finish. But she remembered Langley's blood on the snow, remembered the fear in Tariq's eyes when he begged for his sister, remembered how it had felt to have someone believe in her when she had only been the cook, and she realized that this quiet request in a warm hallway was part of the same long night. So she wiped her hands, took off her apron, and followed Riley outside. An old pickup idled by the curb, exhaust steaming. Inside sat a broad-shouldered young man with a scar along his jaw and both hands locked on the steering wheel as if he expected it to explode. Riley tapped the window. He glared, then saw Maya and went still. Slowly he opened the door and held out something he had been keeping on the dash, a creased photo of the Harridan mess hall, printed from a phone screen, showing Maya years younger behind the serving line, laughing as she waved a spoon. Someone had drawn a cartoon machine gun over the spoon and written Warrior of the Hearth across the bottom. He said he had kept it folded in his pocket through his last tour because it made him remember that somewhere there were people whose whole job was to keep others alive. The words came out of him in gasps and fragments after that. About friends buried overseas, about Christmas lights that looked like tracer fire, about guilt so heavy he sometimes wished the ambush had taken him too. Maya listened with her back against the cold metal of the truck, saying almost nothing, the same way she had once listened beside cots lined in a row. When she finally spoke, she did not try to fix him with a neat speech. She told him she still woke some nights tasting cordite on her tongue. She told him metals had not made the ghost go away. She told him the bravest thing she had ever done might not have been that crawl across the ice, but walking into her own first counseling session and admitting she was not okay. She jerked her chin toward the clinic doors and said quietly that he did not owe the dead a lifetime of misery, that going inside was not betrayal. It was survival, and survival was the one thing his friends would have wanted most for him. Riley stood very still, watching her brother's breathing slow. At last he nodded, almost boyish in that moment, and stepped down from the truck. His hand still shook, but he walked toward the entrance. The automatic doors slid open with a soft sigh, and he disappeared into the fluorescent glow. Riley let out a breath that sounded like she had been holding it for months and threw her arms around Maya in a quick, fierce hug before she could protest. "He listens to you," the girl whispered. "You're the proof he isn't supposed to be dead yet." Those words stayed with Maya long after she went back to the clatter and steam of the kitchen. On Christmas Eve, when her shift ended and the clinic grew quiet, she drove up a short mountain road to a lookout above town, carrying a small wreath and a thermos of cocoa. The valley below glittered with house lights and traffic, tiny and harmless from this height, and the snow under her boots squeaked like the snow on that distant ridge. She set the wreath on a flat rock, spoke the names of the people from Harridan she could remember, and let the wind carry them off like prayers. Standing there, cheeks numb, she understood that the night she had walked out of the kitchen and into the storm had not turned her into a different person. It had simply revealed who she had always been, someone who fed people and stood between them and harm in whatever way she could. Now that meant trays instead of rifles, gentle truths instead of shouted orders, but the heart of it felt the same. She smiled at the thought that somewhere far away another just an army cook was stirring a pot, listening to weather reports grow worse, and wondering if their job mattered. Maybe, she thought, one day the world would ask them for more, and maybe they would surprise themselves the way she once had. Maya took one last look at the lights, sipped the cooling cocoa, and headed back down the trail, her footprints filling slowly with new snow yet still marking a clear path for anyone who might need to follow. In the hush that followed, she knew her life would always stretch between kitchens and storms, and she was finally deeply at peace inside.